in order to try to finish on schedule. And I would like to briefly introduce you with Miguel López Lorenzo. He did his studies in UCL, and he is now at King's College London. And I would like to remind the audience, and I said this in Spanish, si quieren plantear también preguntas en español, se vale. Aquí hacemos la traducción, no hay problema. Bueno, and Miguel, he's Spanish speaking as well, but we're going to keep the structure of the conference in English. Well, and then I would just ask that, or I was asked to finish this workshop on time because we need to leave the room, I think, for other activities in the Institute. So, Miguel, please, you're very welcome, and you have the floor for 30 minutes or so.
So, everyone, yeah, this seems to be working well. Thank you all for coming. It's great to be here, and as we draw to a close of the conference, I think it's all the more important to me to express my gratitude to the organisers of this conference and for all the stimulating papers that we've had a chance to discuss and read over. I've learned a great deal from reading them and engaging in the discussions of their content. And in many ways, being my position in terms of the itinerary coming up last in the list of speakers gives me the opportunity to, in some ways, tailor my remarks to the content of those other papers, because one or two points, some of the papers that we've heard and gone through have stimulated me to think about other ways in which I can present my view, and I'm going to avail myself of that opportunity as I go through summarizing the argument of this paper. So the best place for me to begin in that endeavor is with my starting question, the theoretical problem that I hope to address in the course of my discussion. I take that up in section 2 of the paper, and I suppose one effective way of getting across what my project is that I'm very much stuck in what Scott Hershowitz calls the fly bottle. I take myself to be answering a pressing foundational problem of legal theory that I call the Constitutive Question. And what we have to do in answering this question is provide a constitutive explanation of what makes it the case that the law requires what it does. Now, to make this problem more concrete, I have a recurring example throughout the paper which draws from the English law of trusts. And the problem is simply this. We have a character named Jack, and he wishes to create a trust of land in favour of Jill. And the question is, well, what does Jack need to do in order to validly declare such a trust? And English lawyers will be able to, almost without blinking, tell you that, well, it needs to be made in writing. Okay? And we can point to the Law of Property Act 1925, Section 53(1)b, as a very clear, straightforward example of what Jack needs to do, what the law requires Jack to do in these circumstances by citing the explicit content of a statute. But of course, this is only the beginning of the problem, because a statute and other paradigmatic sources of law are ultimately descriptive facts about what legislatures and courts have said and done, and thereby we have a pressing theoretical problem of explaining, well, what is it about these facts that constitute the legal standards that they do? That's what I have in mind by the Constitutive Question, and that's what I'm hoping to address in the course of my remarks and in the paper itself. So having explained what my question is, let me try and articulate the broad thesis and aims of the paper. The title of my paper is Moralized Conventions in Law, and the paper gets its name because what it tries to do is sketch a new way of approaching the Constitutive Question, which takes as its starting point the root idea that legal standards constitutively depend for their existence and content on a conventional practice of the courts and other officials in a given jurisdiction. I want to try and elaborate that thought and put it in a new way that may have the resources to provide an intriguing answer to the constitutive question that deserves a hearing. Now, for those of us that were here yesterday discussing George Letzis' paper, there immediately emerges a parallel between the two projects. So I think one way I can helpfully articulate the distinctiveness of what I'm trying to do is to draw a comparison between those two projects. What George, as I understood him, was trying to undertake yesterday was to create a broad tent, as it were, to show how a moralized account of social conventions in the legal domain provides a framework which not only enables us to understand perhaps Ronald Dworkin in his best light, but it creates a placeholder theory, as it were, for all different types of theoretical perspectives on the nature of law for which they can subscribe. That's not my project. As I tried to explain in my questions to George yesterday, I find that project too abstract, and it's not clear to me what, if any, distinctive content the project of legal conventionalism retains by pursuing in that fashion. So that's all a long way of saying that my project is slightly more ambitious. I want to sketch an answer to the constitutive question that occupies the same space and competes with Ronald Dworkin's conception of law as integrity. But I'm slightly uncomfortable with the idea of competes because it owes so much to his insights and to the way in which he approaches the question. I think it's more a case of me just trying to fashion out a new way of putting those remarks, but nevertheless has important differences and in that way stands or falls on its own merits. So let's try and go through my steps in order to establish that thesis. Okay? I don't start, as many scholars do, with a debate. I don't start by articulating the nuances of H.L.A. Hart's account of the rule of recognition, the problems that may suffer from, and how we take the next step. I try to build up my account from first principles. It matters to me that this account stands as an intuitive idea and that we, at least in the first instance, try to develop the idea without reference to those kinds of discussions. The first step, which I undertake in section 1 of the paper, is to lay bare a moralized account of social conventions. Okay? So I'm not dealing with the legal case at this stage in the paper. I'm just trying to put on the table what I think social conventions are and how they work as a general matter. And the crux of what I have to say in that section is that a social convention has 3 constitutive elements. The first element is that there exists a common practice among a given group. Now, it's important to be clear here that I use the term practice in a rather thinner sense than sometimes philosophers do. We can use the term practice to refer to the standards that obtain on account of the practice or the standards associated with the practice, but I use it in a much weaker sense. I use the term practice for mere regularities of behavior, of action and cognition, the bare descriptive and contingent facts about what we say and do around here, in virtue of which a social convention obtains. Okay? Now, as is well known, common practices so understood are insufficient for the obtaining of a convention on a given group. This is because there are all sorts of practices that are not conventional in the requisite sense. Okay? So the standard example are cases such as torture, where the mere fact that everybody is converging in a given practice doesn't make that a conventional standard because it lacks what I call the second constitutive element of conventional reasons, which is that the reason to abide by the convention, to conform to the convention, is compliance dependent. That's a term I borrow from André Marmor, and what I mean to suggest by doing so is that the practice itself has to feature as a constituent of the reason for conforming to the convention. The way I prefer to put this, to put it in my own way, rather than Marmor's, is to say the practice is a motivating reason to conform accordingly. Okay? What I mean by motivating reasons are propositional attitudes in light of which agents take some action. Okay? So these can be of many kinds and many different descriptions. So fear, hope, intentions, all of these propositional attitudes and mental states constitute motivational reasons. And what I mean to suggest with respect to the second constitutive element of what a convention is I mean to say that when a convention obtains, we conform to the practice because other people are following it too. Okay? That's the second constitutive element. Now, many general accounts of what social conventions are and how they work stop at that point. Okay? By that point, on a non-moralized account of social conventions, by that point we've already given an account of what standards are associated with the convention. It's the standards that everybody are complying with in virtue of the common practice. A moralized account proceeds in a different fashion. It insists on a third constitutive element of conventions, and these are the moral principles, whatever they are, that may constitutively explain what it is about those descriptive contingent facts, A, about the existence of a common practice, and B, the fact that people have motivating reasons to conform to the practice because of the practice itself, that can justify a standard to conforming to the practice and continuing in that way. So to do that, I revisit an old chestnut driving on a given side of the road. The way you can summarize the thesis, what I call the mark of social conventions, is that there's a common practice of driving on the left-hand side of the road in the UK. People expect other drivers to do the same. That's a motivating reason for them to conform accordingly. And principles such as respect for the value of human life constitutively explain and ground a reason, a real reason, a normative reason for me to conform to that practice. I emphasize that rather too much because there's a tendency to understand a moralized account of social conventions as in a different way. That's to say that we have a non-moralized account of what the standards are, and then there's independently of that moral reasons of why we should conform to the convention constituted merely by the descriptive and contingent facts in this neck of the woods. That's not my view. The moral principles are fundamental. They explain why the convention obtains in the first place. They set the standard. Okay? So that's step one, to lay bare the general account of social conventions informing my account. Step two is to extend that account to the legal domain. And I call that project, or trying to make that idea plausible, the project of legal conventionalism. And underlying that project is the root idea that there's a conventional practice of the courts that holds the key to explaining why certain acts or events have legal significance in a given jurisdiction. Now, that's entirely vague, and intentionally so, because what I want to try and do at this point is to highlight how we can appeal to conventions in the legal domain. We can pursue the project of legal conventionalism in very different ways, because there are three steps that we have to go through. We have to start, as I just did, with a general account of what social conventions are and how they work. We then have to extend that to the legal domain, and we also have to make plausible the thought that it provides an answer to the constitutive question. These are all steps about which we can legitimately disagree and go about arguing them in a different way. So by the project of legal conventionalism, I have in mind a broad end goal, or direction as it were, not any one specific proposal. That's about how we go about doing that. From the perspective of my general account of social conventions, and in the sake of attribution, I keep calling it my for the sake of convenience. Right? I don't deserve the credit for this account of what social conventions are. Its antecedent is account in the Model of Rules 2 by Ronald Dworkin, and it's been recently developed in a paper entitled The DNA of Conventions by George Leptas, which I'm extending for my own purposes, but the notes are there, so I haven't plagiarized anything. What I try to do is I try to mirror the steps in the legal domain as I did with the case of the rules of the road. I start by trying to make clear the idea that there's a common practice involved, that the practice is compliance dependent, and that the heart of the legal conventionalist story has to be identifying the principles that explain why conventional standards obtain in virtue of those two more foundational elements. Okay? So let's start with the thought that there exists a common practice of recognizing certain acts or events in a given jurisdiction at a given time. That's the most neutral way I can try and express the thought underlying Hart's account of a rule of recognition without subscribing to the letter of that story. Because when you take into account, or you explicitly endorse the idea that there are rules of recognition in a given jurisdiction, there comes added theses and premises which for my purposes, I want no part of. I'll get to those in a moment, but just to make that, I just wanted to make that clear at the moment. All I'm saying at this point in the paper is that I think there can be no cause for denying that judges and other officials do, with some regularity, they have a common practice of recognising, say, statutes emanating from the Westminster Parliament in the UK as having legal significance. Okay? That's not yet to take any view about why it is that they have any significance. It's not to say whether the fact that they recognise it generates the legal standard in play. It's just to say that that practice exists, there is that common practice, and I think it's something we can work with in order to refine and make sharper. Okay? The way I go about doing that is to try and say, the practice is compliance dependent. Okay? Now this is another aspect which puts me, from what I heard yesterday, at variance with George Letzer's discussion yesterday. For me, it really does matter that judges conform to the practice because other judges are conforming to it too. Okay? The reason why that is twofold. Firstly, because it's mandated with the overall structure of what I think social conventions are. And secondly, because it's not clear to me what, if any, distinctive content is left for the project of legal conventionalism unless we try to make plausible the thought that judges recognise certain acts or events in a given jurisdiction as having legal significance because other judges are conforming to it too. Now, there are problems with trying to make that thesis plain and plausible. One is the fact of pervasive disagreement about what the law requires, and the other is the fact of the distinction between conviction and otherwise that Dworkin draws attention to. The way I try to at least circumvent that problem is by reflecting closer and in a more detailed way on what motivating reasons are, or what I mean to say when judges have motivating reasons to conform to that practice because of the existence of their practice to that effect. What I try to do is say, I don't want to subscribe, or I don't want to posit any specific motives that judges need to have for conforming to that practice. Okay? What matters to me is that they conform to the practice because others are doing so too, but there could be any number of motivational reasons as to why it is that they do. So a cynical interest in career advancement is a possibility, on my view. A belief in the legitimacy of the regime is another possibility, on my view. I don't require, for example, that they regard the solution as an arbitrary way of providing a way of recognizing certain acts as law. What I'm saying is that once we realize, as I said earlier, that motivating reasons can encompass a broad state of propositional attitudes, then fear, all these unsavory motives can feature as part of a compliance-dependent account of the practice, as long as the fact that they're conforming to it too. So that's why I think the practice is compliance-dependent, because I think it's not a case of me having to put anything positively on the table. It's actually getting off the negative baggage, which, as I say, we can do once we realize the broad scope of motivating reasons in play. Okay, so the action, or where the action is in my account, comes in the third section of the paper, and this is when I try to identify or sketch out a version of legal conventionalism from an interpretive perspective that nevertheless competes with law's integrity and may deserve a hearing. Rather than doing that in the abstract, the strategy I pursued in the paper was to develop my view alongside that which Dworkin discusses in Chapter 4 of the Law's Empire, entitled Conventionalism. Because what I've come to believe is that in that chapter, Dworkin, or rather conventionalism, functions as a picture in Dworkin's thought, and I use that in a specialized sense to mean it bespeaks a discrete set of presuppositions and assumptions about what the project of legal conventionalism involves and what sort of things we have to do in order to defend the idea that there are social conventions at the foundations of law. What I ultimately hope to show in greater depth than I've been able to do in this paper, because my thoughts are still tentative on the positive account, is that we can reconcile the thought that there are such social conventions at the foundations with with the thesis that certain moral principles feature in an answer to the Constitutive Question, and that citizens are entitled to principled consistency in the determination and coercive enforcement of their legal rights and duties. So to try and put that in a less wordy fashion, what I'm trying to say is I don't think that to take the project of legal conventionalism seriously, we need to give up on the kind of constitutive answer to that. The kind of answer to the constitutive question that Dworkin provides. I think we can have both in a new way of answering the project that may give us the best of both worlds. So here's how we go about doing it. Let's first of all look at conventionalism. Okay, in the dialectic or the backstory in Law's Empire, Dworkin presents the would-be legal conventionalist with something of a dilemma. We can either pursue the plain fact view of law. Okay, this is the idea that propositions of law are true in virtue of historical or contingent facts alone, or we can defend the plain fact view of law as an interpretivist thesis. We can recast it as an account of what's really good about legality and what's the point of that constraint. The conventionalism that Dworkin discusses in Chapter 4 of Law's Empire is precisely a view, an interpretive thesis of that kind. However, it has a very distinctive cast, and I find it surprising given his discussion of how a convention may obtain in the model of rules too. So let's think about a moment about where moral principles feature in an account of why and how a convention obtains. Okay? The conventionalism that Dworkin discusses in Chapter 4 of Law's Empire is precisely constructed with the aim that moral principles have no role to play in a constitutive account of why the convention obtains. What the moral principles do is explain why you have independent moral reasons to follow the convention so constituted. Okay? So what I'm suggesting is that bearing in mind the background yesterday between Nikos's discussion between the one-step and two-step procedure in accounts of the constitutive question, I believe that when Dworkin discusses conventionalism in Chapter 4 of Law's Empire, he attributes to even the interpretive version of that project the one-step procedure. The convention is obtained because of the fact of an existence of common practice and motivating reasons to conform accordingly. And then, on top of that, there may be reasons to follow the convention constituted in that way. Okay? Now, I give the references and the textual work to try and make that attribution clear in the paper, and I don't want to go into that and waste too much time on that. What I want to just try and highlight is how my view is different. My version is one step, not two step. Okay? What I mean by that is that as I said earlier, my general view of what conventions are not that they are constituted by descriptive and contingent facts alone, and then there may be moral principles that explain why we should follow them. My view is that whether the convention obtains in the first place depends on the principles. Okay? So in this way, a plurality of principles such as fairness, democracy, protection of legitimate expectations, these explain why a convention obtains in the first place in the legal case. Okay? Now, that change is very subtle, but once you make it, you open up the space for an alternative way of approaching the constitutive question, so it seems to me. One way we can try and go about showing that is to compare it with law's integrity. Okay? So on Dworkin's conception of law's integrity, there are two aspects to the claim which are germane for present purposes. One is the idea that the law is constituted by, or at least there's a constitutive role to play for the principles implicit in the decisions and practice about what legal actors have done. And that one of the main reasons for that, if not the main reason for that, is that it furnishes the possibility of there being principled consistency in the determination of people's legal rights and duties. Okay? I want to accept the first claim and then constrain the scope of the principles with respect to the second claim. So I accept that there are moral principles in play in determining whether legal standards obtain. What makes my view distinctive is that the moral principles are constitutive of conventions that judges and other officials are required to adhere to and follow in determining what the law requires. Okay? Now, at that point, the legitimate objection to raise is to say, well, how is this different from law's integrity? Okay? You haven't said anything different. If moral principles, and they're genuine moral principles, they're not ones that are believed to be so, they're not reasons from a point of view, then what's the point of appealing to conventions in the domain? And the final point which I want to end on is how I try to go about distinguishing the view. Compare two kinds of principles. you've got the principles which are implicit and underlie the decisions and practice of officials. And then you have the principles that explain why, thereby hypothesis, conventional practices bind. Okay? It seems to me that the second type of principles are of a narrower scope than the first. And one of the main reasons why we should appeal to those in the legal domain is because of the problems that attend a conception of law's integrity if we don't. So the basic idea underlying this entitlement to principled consistency that Dworkin eloquently discusses is that it enables a political community to speak with one voice in the face of pervasive disagreement about what justice and fairness requires in that given community. So one major concern which we may want to raise is, does law's integrity enable a community so to speak? Okay? Whose voice? Okay? Whose one voice is being spoken here? Now, my concern is that the principles in play on Dworkin's conception of law are not sufficiently tied to the agency of those whose task it is to identify and enforce standards at law. The proposal is that by constraining no to those which could explain why they have conventions to continue in the practice, that would provide a narrower scope of the principles and thereby avoid this problem of not enabling a community to speak with one voice. So I'm coming up to my time here, but so to summarize the key point, what I'm really concerned about to show at this stage is to open the mind to possibilities, to show how the project of legal conventionalism has legs, as it were, over and beyond remedying a conception of law made prominent by Hedgeley Hart, that we can come at this from an interpretivist angle, and there may be the resources that offers not just a restatement of the view, but one that competes and occupies the same space as law's integrity.
So first, Scott, Nikos, who else? Edgar, please. Scott? Yes. Juan. Yes, all right.
Okay. Hey. So, I guess my question is more in the nature of clarification. I want to make sure I understand the first part, the picture of social convention. So here is something which happens at the University of Michigan Law School and lots of other law schools. At the end of a lecture course, on the very last day, when the professor stops speaking, students stand and they clap and as the professor leaves. And if they're a good person, they try and do this quickly because it's deeply embarrassing. So, social convention, and what do we need to figure out whether there's a social convention there?
Well, whether the mark of a convention, on my account, is that there's something about the practice and the motivating reasons for conforming to the practice that justify a standard to conform. So in the case of that example, I don't think it would be too implausible to say that there's an element of respect involved, perhaps an element of expressing gratitude for the lecture, say.
It happens without, so gratitude possibly, but it happens in every lecture course. It happens without regard to the quality, and we offer some courses that are not of high quality.
Right, okay. So if I understand you correctly, the point is to say, well, that doesn't really strike. That is a social convention, but it's one that doesn't seem to fit.
No, the point is just to hear you sort out. In part because I think I understand parts 1 and 2. I don't think I understand part 3, and so I just want to hear you tell me the story of how I would decide whether what I'm witnessing is a social convention.
Right. You would start by identifying the existence of a practice to that effect, so that with some regularity students do.
Okay, we've got that.
Right. Good. The next thing you would have to show, if it is indeed a convention, is that the reason why they conform to that practice is because the other students are doing so too.
Now, you don't mean the reason.
A constituent part of the conventional reason would have to include a motivating reason to conform because of the fact of people doing.
And it's enough that everyone sitting there thinks, if I was the only one, I wouldn't do this. But I know that other people will do it. That would be, is that enough, or is it, it's not a negative inference that I don't want to be the only person, I don't want to be that kid. I don't want to be the only person standing and clapping.
Yep, that would be fine on my view, because the fact that the practice itself is motivating is a consideration in light of which the agent is clapping.
Okay.
That it's not believed to be something that's a really good thing to do, or the thing to do, doesn't alter the fact that the practice is motivating the agent to conform accordingly.
And now the part where I'm lost is step 3. So tell me how step 3 works.
If it is indeed a convention, we have to appeal to some principle that explains why it's good, why there are good reasons to continue to conform accordingly. If there are no principles that can make that out, then there's no convention on my view. So
my view is there really are no good reasons for this practice, that it signals something bad about the hierarchy of the institution, and it does. Yeah. So now, but does that mean there's no convention? And if there's no convention, then I guess my question is, what is there? What's the word for the thing that there is?
There's a superficially similar practice. So there's a practice that falls short of a convention. So
there's I guess it strikes me that there ought to be a word for things that pass through gates 1 and 2, right? And a lot of people think the word for that's convention. And then I take it that in Model of Rules 2, you're saying something different from Ronnie. You're saying that there's a kind of morality that's conventional, but we might distinguish between mere conventions and conventional parts of morality.
Yeah, no, I understand. No, my view is the seemingly implausible one, where my claim in the first part of the paper is that our concept of convention picks out a normative reason, a distinctive kind of normative reason, which has facts about the existence of a common practice and motivating reasons to conform to it as constituents of a genuine reason to conform.
Yeah.
So if there are no principles that explains why such a reason is obtained, there's no convention on my view.
So the labels don't matter. We can call those things convention, but it seems like things that pass through the first 2 gates but not the third, are fairly common in our social lives, and aren't they proper objects of inquiry? And if you don't want to call those conventions,
no, I never said they were not worthy of studying further.
Yeah.
Well, what I'm saying is,
but to say they're mere practices doesn't get at it, because something that passed through your first gate is a mere practice. There seems to be something new and importantly different when you pass through the second gate.
Well, what motivates me is to give an adequate account of what conventions are and say the standard cases. Mm-hmm. We could take that view. So you may say, well, your view has the implausible account that it's neglecting these things that go through steps 1 and 2. What I'm saying is that if that requires us to then adopt the view that a convention obtains in virtue of those things alone, then we don't explain why a convention obtains in the standard cases. So the normativity of conventions is not explained if we take that view as constitutive of a convention.
That view being which?
Well, if, for example, we took a non-moralized account of social convention, which is basically reasons from a point of view, we would be able to. So the idea is that what standard the convention sets is determined by the practice and motivating reasons to conform to it accordingly. That's step 1. And then whether there's any moral reason to follow that convention is a separate part of the inquiry, right? I don't accept that, okay? The reason why I don't accept that is because I don't think that provides an adequate account of what's involved in why a conventional standard obtains. So that's why I'm forced to explain, well, in those cases I have to say that it's a practice that falls short of a convention strictly sensu. That's what's motivating me to take that harder line.
My question is very much around this, so shall I continue? Maybe Scott can add. So you say that the non-moralized account of conventions is the point of view account. I thought, just let me finish my thought. I thought that the non-moralized account of convention is the one that just says what's happening and puts a label on it. It's not a view that any standard is constituted thereby. So I would call it a convention if there is a group, if it is a tradition, there's a long-standing practice in the sense of pattern action in an institution, the army, a school, a boarding school, that newcomers would be hazed. And everybody, all the older kids, the older hands, have a motivating reason, accept something, some consideration as a reason to conform to that practice. So they haze the newcomers. And that most of the newcomers, actually, when they become, upperclassmen, whatever, they haze the fresh ones. So I would call that a convention. I haven't said anything about standard. I'm just saying what people do. So that's, right. In my book, that's a non-moralized account. And then morality comes and inspects this thing and declines to support conformity. Or morality comes along and inspects this thing and supports conformity. Now, conformity, another distinction here is, a reason to conform doesn't turn only on the content of the convention. It also turns on whether it's a great idea to begin with, but also turns on on considerations such as protecting expectations or things like this, reliance. It could be the case that a convention is completely pointless. There's nothing good about it, but since it's people expect it to happen, and it might be upset in certain ways if you refuse to stand up, then it's a good idea to stand up. In Oxford, high table. The dons come in, everybody stands up. It's not a good idea that they should stand up, but it's been happening, and if you don't stand up, it becomes a little embarrassing for everyone. It's not a big deal, so you just stand up. All right. So, as Scott says, we can use the label, we can use names any way, please. Why do you think that withholding the name convention from, maybe it's not what you think. I thought that you want to withhold the name convention from the purely descriptive account. No standard, no nothing. Stuff happens. People do these things, and they also think that some consideration is a reason for them to join. I would call that convention, you wouldn't. I can see no reason why withholding that label and reserving it only from an account whereby the settled practice and the attitudes and all that is accompanied by a genuine moral reason to conform. Why would that make a difference? Why not just use the descriptive part, practice and attitude, and the moral part that determines its moral relevance? But maybe that's not what you're saying. Maybe what you're saying is that you don't want to call a convention a point of view version of the story.
Right, okay, so there's a couple of different points there. So the first thing to say is I'm interested in the idea of conventional standards. I'm interested in the idea of the standards that obtain in virtue, or I wouldn't want to say in virtue of conventions, so it goes against... In virtue of practice, right. So I didn't even consider... and my point is not one of linguistic hygiene. It's not for me to deny calling a practice conventional. I wasn't concerned with the concepts or tools we might use to describe what people are up to. What I have in mind when I distinguish between a non-moralized and a moralized account of conventions are different stories about why a standard obtains in virtue of common practice. The non-moralized account is one which says that the standards are obtained primarily by beliefs on the part of a practitioner that the practice provides good reasons to conform accordingly, but they needn't be there. It's a contingent matter whether they are or not. And the view which I hold is the alternative story, which is that if the principles makes it the case, there are good reasons to conform accordingly, then a conventional standard obtains. Now, the way to come to the second part of your comment regarding, well, where does the moral aspect of this all come into play? What excites me about that account of what conventions are is because it changes the order of explanation with respect to moral considerations and conventional standards. I'm trying to reject the idea that when you give an account of why a convention binds, what you do is you start with common practices and beliefs on the part of the practitioners about what that consists in. That sets the standard, and then, independent of that, you then have a moral story to tell about why you should follow the convention so constituted.
That's what you want to resist?
That's what I want to resist.
Okay,
right.
Okay,
fine.
Yes. That's what Dworkin wants to resist, right?
Yes, indeed, in the model of rules too. But that's not the underlying picture of social conventions which he attributes to conventionalism in Chapter 4 of Law of Empire. That's what I'm saying.
So can I just, because I think I'm mostly with Nikos, but I'm not quite sure. There may be a difference between us. So, and I think there's definitely a difference between us. So, the story I would tell would run something like this. There is a convention in virtue of the fact that people regularly stand and clap at the end of the lecture, and that they comply only because, only out of the expectation, or part out of the expectation that other people will also stand and clap at the end of the lecture, and that that combination of things does set a standard by which people's behavior can be measured. And there's probably lots of standards, right? But the central one is the one that's the object of the attitude. I do this.
But in virtue of what is the standard?
Well, hang on. I do this, right? Where this is clap at the end of the lecture because I expect other people to do it, and we can ask on any particular occasion: did Hershevich clap at the end of the lecture? Did Nikos clap at the end of the lecture? Now, to say that there's a standard, right? Standards come cheap. Is not to say that anybody's appropriately judged by the standard, right? And that's where morality comes in. Right now, we find out which standards are the standards which are normative for people, right? Which standards are the standards by which we should criticize people, which standards are the standards we should expect people to consider among their normative reasons and act on. And I take the point of model of rules to be that that those standards, right, the standards that are justified or warranted by our practices, may run beyond or fall short of the standards that are, say, the objects of the attitudes that people have within the practice, right? But we don't need to even deny that they're standards, right? So one way that Dworkin doesn't say there's no such thing as a social rule in Hart's sense. He just says that when people are having a conversation about what they ought to do, nobody's appealing to a social rule, right? They're appealing to a normative rule, which may or may not have the same content as the social rule. And the really important thing to see is that they can come apart. Right? But we don't need to deny that they're social rules in Hart's sense, or deny that they're conventions in the sense that Nico Stein would say, or even to deny that there are conventional standards. Right? All we need to deny is that those conventional standards are yet normative.
The normative idea of standard wouldn't bother him.
Well, I'm not sure how that can be made to work, and I'd like to pick up a closer on the idea of a standard, because if you're taking that notion of a standard, it's not clear to me in virtue of what there's any criticism of the behaviour involved. Because if you were to take that view of what makes it the case that the standard obtains, then exclusively in virtue of descriptive facts about common practices and what people believe, that's not a standard on my view. I don't want any part of that. Now, regardless of what Dworkin has to say, that's the wrong view to take, in my view. If there's a genuine standard in play, it's a justified standard of criticism which obtains in virtue of the principle that explains.
So I'll just observe there's a lot of work being done by the word obtain and by genuine, right? So here is a standard by which we could judge somebody's behavior. Everyone ought to be as rude as possible at conferences. That's a standard, right? We can ask whether the people in this room have conformed to that standard, right? It's not a standard that is properly normative for anybody.
No, and that point is a standard people believe to be a standard. It's not yet a standard unless we've done the work to show why it is that you have to conform with it accordingly. So yes, I'm heavily happy for you to say we can talk about it. We can talk about it in a weakened sense, and then say there are standards that people believe to be standards for them, but that's not the genuine article. On my view, and that's what I'm interested in conventions, because I think there are cases where they do pick out the genuine article because of the underlying principle to explain why those facts are significant.
I cede the microphone.
It's okay. Before Edgar, I think just a minute. Professor Guest wants just to maybe.
Did you want to finish off? I was going to change the subject slightly.
Okay. So right? Maybe Edgar first, and then okay.
Thank you. On Andrei Marmor's account of constitutive conventions, partial autonomy performs a very important role, and by that I think that Marmor means that to a certain extent the practice establishes its own point, and the practice establishes also a set of parameters or or standards for the evaluation of participants' contribution to that practice. In that sense, Marmor understands the partial autonomy of constitutive practices. And he has an argument, basically, if what you are calling a constitutive practice does not allow for this partial autonomy from morality, basically it is not a constituted practice, because you are not constituting anything when you say to people that they have to follow the principles of morality. Following the principles of morality or political morality is not itself a constitutive practice, and I think you get to this conclusion when you try to give to principles the constitutive role. That's why I think Marmor avoids the normativity question, because he wants to secure that there's going to be a space for partial autonomy, and that's the space where constitutive conventions really make their work. I mean, creating a partial autonomy from morality. If you say that principles are constitutive of the practice, basically you're saying that people are following morality, and that's not a constitutive practice at all, I think.
Well, there are a couple of points to sharpen up there. I mean, first of all, when we talk about constitutive conventions or the antecedent of that, constitutive rules, along the lines of John Searle, yeah, there's an innocuous way of understanding that thesis, and there's a more loaded way of understanding that thesis. The loaded way of understanding the thesis, which is the one that Marmor endorses, is to appeal to conventions with the express intention and ultimate end goal of isolating conventional practices from the space of reasons more generally. Okay, and the way this works is explicitly moves from a reasons point of view account of the normativity of social conventions, which I reject. Okay, I reject that because I don't actually see how the conventional standards which we all believe to obtain are adequately explained on that account. Okay, now the interesting thing which I want to pick up on in your remarks are, well, then do I give up on the idea of there being constitutive conventions at all, right? Because otherwise, where am I going with this whole project of legal conventionalism, right? Yeah. Well, I think Dworkin himself provides a good way of answering that question. We can switch the picture, as it were, or change the model from constitutive rules to structuring principles within morality. Okay? And conventions are one of those cases where what we say and do has a discrete moral impact on what we ought to do. Okay? So a common practice can matter, okay, and can create new obligations, rights and duties associated with it. A convention is a more specialized case because it's where not just the fact of a common practice, but the fact that it's compliance dependent can then create a structuring principle which explains why a conventional standard obtains. So in that sense, I can talk about there being constitutive rules or certain practices providing the foundation for a whole different class of rights and duties. But that doesn't mean I need to tie into Marmor's account of constitutive conventions and the reasons point of view account on which that relies.
But given that you didn't specify, at the beginning of your talk you said that you didn't want to buy the hard story of rules of recognition, and and I think that you have, to a certain extent, not to buy that story, but at least to differentiate which practices are you referring. Because, for instance, recognizing a certain pattern as a valid pattern of law, for instance, may have its own constitutive standards. For instance, interpreting that pattern may have other constitutive standards, and applying that standard may have other ones. And I think you need some work of clarification in that respect.
Well, yeah, as long as it's not... There's certainly points of clarification that need to be brought in, but I think what your question is trying to move from a very clear and established understanding of what we're doing when we appeal to conventions in the legal domain and what I'm doing. So you mentioned an interesting thing just quickly there, saying about there may be two sorts of standards in play. There's the ones about the pattern of the action, and then the application when you move to that stage. That's not how my direction moves. Okay, so I start with contingent and descriptive facts about what people are doing. Okay? And what they're doing is they're recognizing certain acts or events as counting as law. Okay? Now, that's not yet to say I am endorsing a rule of recognition account of law. It's the basic idea with which I take to be a very fertile idea in Hart, but it doesn't come with any of the baggage that also comes with the concept of law. The principal baggage which I have in mind is the non-moralized account of what conventions are, which I articulated slightly better in my response to Nikos, and also a picture of what law is and how it works, whereby what these practices do is they put people in positions of practical authority to then create legal norms simply by saying so. That's not how my account moves. My account moves with facts about a common practice, trying to make plausible the idea that the practice is compliance dependent, and then saying that makes a difference, and it makes a discrete impact on what officials ought to be doing, and that takes us into the domain of law. That's the structuring principle. So that's how my account moves. So that's one of the reasons why I try to build up from first principles, but it does bring with it the risk of me not being able to isolate where I stand with reference to what. But I try to. Jurisprudence has been like that for far too long. But yeah.
Okay, Stephen, please.
It's getting late in the day, and there are bits here I can't quite understand. So if you clarify it, other people might find it quite clear, but I don't. I think the general question is how this relates to complement or criticise Dworkin's theory of integrity, and this is the way I see it. I think that Hart is characterised correctly by Dworkin as a conventionalist, and I've always thought that Hart had thought there was a moral reason behind his legal positivism, that is that the rule of recognition for whatever reasons people were motivated to accept it, officials, judges were motivated to accept it. It existed, as he kept on saying, as a matter of empirical fact. And he thought that this was a good thing because, as he says in Chapter 9, you can have a choice between a narrower natural law conception of law and you have a wider positivistic conception, which is his own one. And he preferred the wider conception, uses these terms, because it enables a very clear distinction between law and morality. And with that, you could face the official abuse of authority, as he said, or, as he said, the fact that the legal certification of something as legally valid is not conclusive of the question of obedience. And he had that in the background of his horror at the Nazi view of law, right? Because he talks about that at the beginning in the Hart-Fuller debate, very closely summarised in chapters 8 and chapters 9. All right, so here we have a view of convention as something very factual. That is what was the law, and it serves a moral purpose. And in these chapters in Law's Empire, Dworkin sets out three theories. One is pragmatism, one's conventionalism, one is his own theory, integrity, and then he compares the moral reasons for accepting each of them. And he's very clear about conventionalism. He thinks it's got virtues. It's clear. It's got a moral virtue that it places very high amongst its principles, that people's reasonable expectations should be met, because you have the convention to which you can refer. But his three arguments against it were, one, that it didn't account adequately for hard cases, it just left a gap there which could be filled with morality. And secondly, he thought that it didn't allow judges to be creative in the right way. It sort of gave them the kind of open, strong discretion of morality in general to make moral decisions. And thirdly, he thought it gave a very empty view of community, regards a community that's just run by conventional rules as a runic community. And in face of these criticisms, he proposes integrity, which can answer those three difficulties of conventionalism. So my question is, how does what you're saying about moralised conventions connect with this story? How does it connect with Dworkin? Is it critical of this? I suspect, just listening to it but not quite following, that your account could collapse, to use Dworkin's term, into conventionalism.
Okay, well that's very helpful. There are 2 points to bring out. The first thing is what I call a moralised account of conventions in the legal domain is not normative positivism. okay, which is the view which you more or less articulated in reference to Hart's point. Because the starting assumption, which I'm trying to battle against and trying to reject, is the idea that the only reason why you might want to appeal to conventions in the legal domain is in defense of a positivist conception of law, by which I mean that moral principles don't have any role to play in an account of why legal rights and duties obtained. That's not where I'm coming from. Okay, so
well, if I could just add to that, and I won't have a sort of interchange with you, but I'll just add to that. There's no suggestion there, is there, that Dworkin thinks that there are no conventions within law. I mean, he clearly did. The convention that you require so many votes in the House of Commons and so many votes in the House of Lords to produce a particular outcome. There are conventions.
Yes, in what he might call the silly and uninteresting sense. It's one thing for Dworkin to make remarks to convention, but he doesn't believe that what the law requires is conventionally determined.
Of course not. No, it's not positivism.
And I'm trying to offer a more plausible way of swallowing that idea. Okay? So the way in which you get about doing that is to debunk some of the assumptions and starting points about A, what conventions are, and B, what it is, to explain why they may be interesting in the legal domain. Okay? So the way to come to the second point of how this ties in with Dworkin, you're absolutely right, because you put your finger on that which I have much more to do, and which is what I take to be the hardest point of my account, which is that once you take the view that conventions obtain in virtue of moral principles that explains what it is about what we're doing which has a normative significance, that sounds very similar to the type of understanding of law that Dworkin is putting.
Or the kind of understanding of conventionalism that collapses into integrity.
Yes, I'm worried about that collapsing, not the other type of collapse. I think I've done enough not to collapse into conventionalism in law's empire. I'm worried that I have nothing of interest over and beyond what law and integrity has to say, and that's where. But you're proposing a theory of law that's of law as convention. It's a grand kind of theory like the Shapiro's view. Is that right, or are you only talking about certain conventions? No, because, well, first of all, Shapiro's argument needn't rely on conventions, and in fact is best.
I meant a generalised theory, like planning.
Well, not if it requires us to identify one big moral principle that could underlie everything that's going on. That would be silly. So you couldn't just say, protected expectations, or the ideal of respecting the decisions of democratically elected bodies. That principle can explain everything that's going on in the legal domain. I can't see how that account could be made to work. What I want to say is that the practices involved, the common actions of what judges and other officials are doing, has a normative significance. Okay, and it has a normative significance because it's a convention, because of the conventionality of the practice. Okay, but I understand that conventionality in a different way, where moral principles are intrinsic into the account of why a convention obtains in that case, right? And the thought is, by making that distinction, you then have more work to do in explaining, how is that different from law's integrity? And it's different in its moral edge, not in its conceptual edge or account of what conventions are. It's a disagreement over the scope of the moral principles that could play a role in constituting legal standards. I'm worried that we don't enable a political community to speak with one voice when the principles that govern the standards which are commercially enforced upon them can in principle have nothing to do with the agency of those whose task it is to apply and enforce legal standards. But if the principles are actually more constrained to those which explain what it is about their practice that generate the duty to conform, then in principle there can be no moral principles that don't feature in the agency of those whose task it is to imply the standards, because it's constituted in part by what they're saying and doing around here. And I think that may provide a better account of how a community can speak with one voice. So that's what I have to make better. But that's what I'm relying on at the moment.
Okay.
Can you pass over the microphone to Larry, please?
Thank you. So I've been reflecting about your early colloquies with Scott and Nikos and the third gate, and I realize that this is in part a question asking for clarification, but it seems to me whichever way you move in clarifying it may raise some problems. The question is this. When you take your third step and you, in effect, ask for a moral reason that the first two conditions are satisfied, or the second condition is satisfied, that people are complying with this, what moral reason do they have for complying with it, even given that others are doing it? It seems to me there's a minimal view of what kind of moral reason has to be supplied at your third stage, and a very broad view. And minimal view would simply be you need some moral reason for this practice, without much more to say. The broad view is, in some quite elaborate, all things considered way, this practice has very special moral stature. Neither of those seems plausible. If all you have found to make this a convention is some moral explanation, which isn't laughable or isn't wrong, then it's very unclear how you've given it any advantage when you move forward with it, because it's then going to contend with other moral possibilities, with much better practices that would realize the moral virtues of the first practice much better. It would seem as though you've given it very little stature in what comes later. But if instead what you have done is provided some grand moral justification for this practice, you've done all the work that's going to come later. So I'm not sure what this third step looks like, whether it's the minimal or the maximum one or some other moralization. What's the nature of the moralization in your third step?
Okay, so it moves in this direction. So I'm saying that social conventions, as we understand them, our concept of them, have a certain aspect to them which is theoretically interesting. This is the idea in which we use them regularly to appraise, guide, and inform people's conduct. Okay? And the theoretical problem is, how does that magic happen? How is it the descriptive facts about what we're saying and doing generate such a standard and thereby provide a justified basis for evaluation or criticism? Okay? The third step is to identify what moral considerations, if any, explain what it is about those two more basic conditions that explains why such a standard obtains. So it's both, it's not what I consider to be groundbreaking or in any sense counterintuitive. It's saying that if it is to bind, then there have to be reasons to explain how and why that is so. Now, it's interesting, if it has any interest, it's in how it stands with the prevailing view of what we do when we're discussing conventions elsewhere in the literature. What we're doing then is we're not invoking moral considerations to explain why a convention obtains and what it requires. Okay? So I'm offering a view of how morality determines what conventions require of people to do. Okay? And that strikes me as interesting, because in the legal case, we regularly appeal to certain conventions in explaining why it is that certain legal standards obtain. So if I can then rely on a general account of conventions which shows that moral considerations are intrinsic into what they are and how they work, then when that transfers over to the legal domain, then we have the potential of a scope of saying how moral considerations could feature in a constitutive explanation of legal standards in a way that hasn't yet been appreciated. So that's where I'm coming from, and why the third step is interesting, because it's where the action is. Because for me, that's the mark of where you move from a convention to a mere practice. So that's what turns on the third step.
So the third step is a rather thoroughgoing, widespread, contingency-embracing, conflict-anticipating moralization of the practice, right?
I'll come back to the rules of the road. Okay, so I take it everyone in this room agrees that we have reason to converge in driving on a given side of the road. Yeah, we have reason to comply with that action. I'm taking that to be uncontroversial, but it's not theoretically clear as to how and why that is so. There's difficult philosophical problems explaining why that is so. Okay, it seems to me that the way we go about doing that is in three steps. We say, well, clearly the fact that people are doing this with some regularity.
I may just be missing something, because I don't understand the nature of the third step's moral judgment. I'm thinking, for example, about the practice of standing up when professors leave the room in Michigan. I wish they did that in my neck of the woods. But the question is, what do you have to believe? Do you have to believe that all things considered, this is a morally optimal practice? Do you have to believe that it's morally acceptable? Do you believe it brings some moral virtue with it? These are all different kinds of things. I could probably construct a moral virtue, to which Scott would reply, well, yes, but that moral virtue is overwhelmed by certain moral deficits. Do we have to go that far? How far do we have to go in the moral qualification of this as a social convention? That's the question.
What we have to do is identify the principle that explains what's good about the practice. So take queuing. So we take queuing.
Is that what we need to do? Or is it that we need to explain what's good about joining the practice? What I mean is, some practices are really pointless. There's nothing good about them in themselves.
I know in my account.
But people have got used to them and count on them, continue on their continuation, and they would be surprised or offended or upset, and we have reason not to upset them.
Right.
And that's why you have to conform.
Yeah, but I take that to be in spirit of what I'm saying, because if there are those good reasons, it's the principles that are explaining why we have reason not to upset their.
You don't just look at what's happening in the practice and make moral judgment.
No.
You have to look at the consequences of its existence.
Yeah, I take it Larry's point is like this. So here's something you might say. It makes some professors smile. They walk out of that room and they think, it makes them feel. But then on the other side of the ledger, right? I could say it establishes an unfortunate kind of hierarchy among students and professors. I could say it reduces any signal that actually students might want to send of gratitude because you know that they'll clap inevitably, right? So it minimizes the chance to actually say thank you. So we come up with, it puts pressure on students who genuinely don't feel gratitude. I've had conversations with students about this. They feel like they have to stand and signal and participate in something that makes them sends a message they'd like to reject. So here are lots of reasons, right? So does it turn out because we've identified some thin thing, which is making people feel good, is a good thing to do, that there's a convention just for that reason, or do we need to somehow balance all of these things together and decide that on the whole this is valuable in order to think that there's a convention?
And note, it isn't just this practice. It's going to have to tie with lots of institutions at the University of Michigan Law School.
Well, there isn't a practice in clinical classes. There's a practice among, for professors delivered by research. So that's a negative, Yeah.
Well, that brings in two extra complications, which I don't think I need to adjudicate on. One is, well, how do I identify the group whose practice this is, right? So in order to give an account of a convention, you need to begin by postulating a group or given community. So one concern which you just raised was, well, how big is the group? Okay?
No.
So I don't need to.
Same students, they clap for some people and not for others.
But wasn't the point that there are different parts of the university, different departments that aren't engaged in this?
No, it's within the law school. They clap
okay.
for research professors and they don't clap for clinical professors.
Right. Okay, fine. Yeah. Okay, so getting that off.
But the point here is that here I can give you a laundry list of things that are unfortunate about this practice, and the question is it enough for you to say that there's a convention, that we identify something good in it, or do you need to say, all things considered, this is worthwhile? And
right,
yeah.
No. So it's not, the judgment is not about the consequences of the practice as such, right? The idea is to say, my view is that what a convention is, right, of its nature, is a distinctive kind of a good reason to conform accordingly, a normative reason. Conventions are normative reasons. The moral judgment, which I'm saying, is a moral inquiry about what it is about what's being done that explains why that obtains. If no such account can be given, right, then I don't think there's a conventional standard in play.
So it's just clarifying. It's the thin version then. We found something good in this.
Well, something good in it could come apart from an account of whether you have a reason to conform. right? I'm concerned in justifying conformity to the practice rather than there's something good about it.
We found something good in conformity.
Well, no, it's that you ought to conform. It's not that it's good that you can conform. It's that the fact that there exists this practice and people are motivated to conform to it accordingly makes it a requirement for you to conform accordingly because of some moral principle. So that's why the model is the rules of the road. It's not the case that there's something good about whether I drive on the left or the right. It's that I'm wronging people if I don't, given the practice and given the motivational states of other people. It's about right and duty. It's not about the good of the practice or whether there's something we can say for the practice regarding it. I'm saying that what a convention is a distinctive kind where you're obligated to conform because of what's going on in the world. And the moral inquiry that I'm interested in is the principles that explain why that obtains. Okay? That's what I'm saying. Which in that sense it's both intuitive, but at the same time different given how we usually think and talk about social conventions.
Okay, so maybe we are over the time, and I would like to thank Miguel, and I would clap very warmly. And as you all know, we are at the end of our program. I would like to thank all the assistants, all the young students who were here until the end. A very special word for all our guests who came from very far and had all this jet lag and all this time to debate about these topics. Of course, I have to say a word as well about the Supreme Court, who financed in part this seminar, hoping, of course, to have more initiatives like this for the future. The coordinator and the side of the court, Carlos Perez, couldn't make it to come and be here to thank it himself. But, well, to Juan Vega, to all the coordinators, I'm just here transmitting this thankful word also for all these becarios here, all the young students in the Institute and all the students in the doctoral program. So thank you very much, and hopefully see you very soon. Have a way back.